The entire courtroom froze when Justice Stephen Breyer uttered 6 words no one expected. His voice, calm yet commanding, cut through the dense air of the chamber. "Her brilliance cannot be ignored today." Gasps rippled across the room. Clerks dropped their pens. Reporters raised their heads in disbelief, their fingers pausing mid-type. For a moment, even the weight of history seemed suspended, as though time itself bent to witness what had just been spoken. At the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. She didn't stumble. Her eyes stayed steady, locked forward as if she had prepared for this exact moment her entire life. Every slight she had endured, every dismissive smirk, every whispered doubt, now stood trial beside her. And Breyer, one of the most respected voices of authority, had confirmed what others tried to deny. The chamber wasn't used to someone like her commanding its attention. She wasn't born into privilege. She wasn't groomed by power brokers in quiet clubs. She was a fighter shaped by grit and sharpened by adversity. And now, as his words lingered in the air, everyone present was forced to face a truth they could no longer ignore. Brilliance has no pedigree. Dignity answers to no hierarchy. But even as the courtroom froze in awe, one question burned hotter than the lights above. How did we get here? Because behind this frozen moment was a story of arrogance, struggle, and unshakable resolve. And to understand why this single moment shook the chamber, we need to rewind. The case had already drawn national attention long before the first gavel struck. Television networks cleared their schedules, headlines screamed across feeds, and whispers in Washington carried a single theme. This wasn't just another legal argument. It was a test of identity, credibility, and power. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. On one side, seasoned voices of authority leaned back in their chairs, convinced the outcome was already decided. To them, Jasmine Crockett was an outsider, too fiery, too raw, too unwilling to play by their rules. Their faces carried smug confidence, the kind of quiet contempt that said, "You don't belong here." But outside those wooden doors, the nation was watching with different eyes. For countless young people, immigrants and families who had felt the sting of dismissal, Crockett was hope. She wasn't flawless, but she was real. She stood as proof that dignity could walk into a chamber built on exclusion and still demand recognition. For them, every word carried the weight of vindication. The debate that unfolded wasn't only about legal precedents, it was about belonging. Each exchange was a tug-of-war between an old guard trying to protect its grip and a new voice determined to break through. Cameras captured every flicker, every pause. Commentators analyzed her tone, mocked her cadence, questioned her composure as if brilliance had to sound like theirs to count. The question they pushed again and again: could she hold her own in a room designed to push her out? The courtroom became a mirror of the country itself, divided between doubt and hope, arrogance and courage. Each time she spoke, the line grew sharper. And then, in the middle of that rising tension, came the moment when skepticism would collide headfirst with conviction. And that's when the nation saw the arrogance of power collide with the brilliance of preparation. The whispers of doubt had begun long before that day. They flowed through think tanks, echoed in op-eds, and spilled across late-night commentary. To the gatekeepers of tradition, Jasmine Crockett was a disruptor, too bold, too unrefined, too unwilling to stay quiet. It wasn't one opponent she faced. It was the weight of a culture deciding who was worthy of respect. Senior figures who had lived their entire lives inside privilege looked at her and saw an intruder. They mistook her confidence for arrogance, her conviction for recklessness, her refusal to shrink as a violation of their rules. Their criticism came dressed in civility, but carried the sting of dismissal. She has passion, but lacks polish. Sharp, but inexperienced. Too emotional for this stage. phrases designed to sound fair, but used only to remind her she was not one of them. Behind the bench, older figures leaned on pedigrees she would never have. Ivy League networks, family dynasties, political connections that shielded them from rejection. They couldn't imagine fighting uphill battles daily, so they assumed she couldn't withstand them either. Their vision of power was inherited. Hers was earned. Commentators piled on. They turned her presence into a spectacle, mocking her cadence, dissecting her mannerisms, questioning her seriousness. For many watching, these dismissals carried a sting that was all too familiar. Job interviews where names mattered more than resumes, classrooms where voices were ignored, boardrooms where accents were mocked. This was the real antagonist, not a single man or woman, but the invisible walls of privilege built to suffocate outsiders. It was arrogance dressed as tradition, exclusion disguised as neutrality. And it was loud. So loud, many assumed Crockett's voice would eventually fade. But they miscalculated. Every doubt became fuel. Every smirk, every condescending remark hardened her resolve. They thought they were silencing her, but in truth, they were forging her into something unbreakable. But while they dismissed her, they never imagined how her journey had forged her into steel. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in marbled courtrooms or hushed law libraries. It began in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce and respect had to be fought for. She grew up knowing the weight of being underestimated, the sting of being told what she couldn't do, the quiet barriers built to keep people like her from crossing into spaces of influence. Yet those barriers did not break her. They sharpened her. Her childhood was filled with lessons not from privilege but from resilience. Family members who worked 2 jobs taught her that dignity was not defined by income. Teachers who saw her potential reminded her that brilliance was not limited to a particular zip code. She absorbed each lesson and turned it into fuel. By the time she reached law school, she had already mastered the art of persistence. Still, her fight was far from over. Entering the legal world meant walking into rooms where she was often the only one who looked like her. Eyes lingered longer than they should. Doubts were voiced louder than praise. When she spoke, people measured her tone before they measured her words. She was forced to prove again and again that her seat at the table was not charity, it was earned. Instead of shrinking, she became sharper. She defended clients who couldn't afford champions. She walked into spaces where justice felt uneven and tilted the scales with preparation and fire. She didn't just practice law, she lived it. Her work became less about titles and more about people. Immigrants seeking fairness, workers fighting exploitation, families demanding dignity. She transformed her pain into purpose. And with each victory, she carried scars that told a larger story, of bias she had survived, of insults she had endured, of ceilings she had cracked even when they didn't want to break. Her journey was not polished, but it was authentic, and that authenticity resonated with the people she served. They saw in her not just a lawyer, but a reflection of their own struggles, their own possibility. When she stepped into politics, the resistance followed her. Critics said she was too blunt, too direct, too unwilling to bend. But that bluntness was precisely what gave her credibility. She refused to disguise truth behind flowery language or hide passion behind calculated restraint. She understood that power responds not to politeness, but to persistence, and the more they tried to contain her voice, the louder it became. Her rise wasn't a story of shortcuts or smooth ascension. It was the slow, grinding climb of someone determined to turn doubt into destiny. From courtrooms to campaign trails, from community meetings to national debates, Jasmine Crockett embodied what it meant to carry both the weight of history and the fire of possibility. By the time she stood in that chamber with Justice Breyer, she wasn't just representing herself. She carried the countless faces who had been overlooked, the voices that had been silenced, the talent that had been ignored. Every insult had hardened her, every setback had prepared her, every small victory had brought her to this exact place. And in that courtroom, every hardship she endured was about to erupt into one defining moment. The courtroom was not a place for mercy that day. Every question hurled at Jasmine Crockett was sharpened like a blade. Senior voices cut in with interruptions, their tone more dismissive than curious. They weren't just challenging her arguments, they were challenging her right to even make them. But she did not flinch. Each time a condescending remark slipped into the air, she met it with calm clarity. Her voice carried no tremor, no hesitation. She leaned on preparation, layering fact upon fact, weaving precedent into principle, until her words stood taller than the interruptions meant to diminish them. The exchanges grew tense. One skeptic leaned forward, smirking as he asked a question designed to corner her. Cameras caught the curl of arrogance on his lips. Crockett responded without raising her voice, dismantling his premise in a single breath. The smirk vanished, replaced by the kind of silence only truth can create. Another voice tried to dismiss her as missing the larger point, but she redirected with precision, forcing him back to the very text he had overlooked. She was not just answering questions, she was exposing the gaps in their assumptions. The harder they pressed, the steadier she became. Around the chamber, the audience could feel the shift. The power dynamic was cracking. What began as a test of her composure was turning into a revelation of her strength. Even those who doubted her found themselves leaning forward, listening closely, as if waiting for her to falter. Yet she never did. The tension was no longer subtle. It pulsed in the air, visible in every glance exchanged between the judges, every shuffle of papers meant to mask discomfort. Crockett's presence was no longer an interruption to tradition. It was a direct challenge to it. Still the skeptics pushed, hoping to provoke a mistake. They wanted her to stumble, to raise her voice, to confirm the caricature they had built around her. But instead, she gave them the opposite. Composure so unshakable it rattled those who tried to shake her. The chamber's temperature rose, not from shouting matches, but from the collision of two forces, entrenched power and undeniable brilliance. Every rebuttal carried weight. Every pause made the silence louder. And then, at the height of that tension, the room shifted again. The questions slowed. The interruptions stopped. For the first time, the old guard seemed unsettled, unsure of their footing. Crockett had not only held her ground, she had turned it into her stage. Then came the silence. When she leaned forward, eyes fixed, and spoke. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to feel it. Every cough, every shuffle, every click of a pen seemed suddenly too loud. Then Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone, her eyes locked not on the skeptics, but on the truth itself. She began with logic. Her words sliced clean through the tangled arguments that had been thrown at her. She cited precedent after precedent, not as a list, but as a story, weaving law into lived reality. Her tone was calm, but her clarity left no room for doubt. Each point struck like a hammer against glass, exposing cracks in the opposition's foundation. But logic was only the beginning. With each line, her voice gained fire. Not anger, but conviction. She spoke of what justice meant beyond the pages of case law, of the families whose lives depended on decisions made in rooms like this, of the people who had been ignored for too long. Every syllable carried the weight of those unseen voices, and suddenly the debate was no longer academic. It was human. The skeptics shifted uncomfortably. One reached for his notes, flipping pages as though the answer might appear there. Another avoided eye contact altogether, staring down at his hands. The arrogance that had filled the chamber minutes before was evaporating in real time. And then came the moment that would be replayed on screens across the nation. Crockett leaned closer, her voice steady but sharp, and dismantled the core argument of her loudest critic. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. She simply laid out the truth with such precision that the entire room inhaled at once. Gasps echoed. The chamber, usually immune to drama, suddenly felt like an arena. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Court clerks glanced at each other, stunned. Even the most stoic faces on the bench betrayed flickers of surprise. Justice Stephen Breyer, who had listened with a stillness that carried weight, finally spoke. His voice broke the tension like a verdict. Her brilliance cannot be ignored today. The words hung heavy, undeniable. For a man whose career had spanned decades, whose respect was not handed out casually, to speak them in that chamber was more than acknowledgement. It was validation. A tide had turned. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She stood in that moment with quiet composure, knowing that respect is not something you seize by force, but something earned through resilience and truth. The chamber froze around her, not because she had demanded attention, but because she had commanded it. In that silence, power shifted. The old guard could no longer pretend she was an outsider, unfit for the stage. They had been forced to confront the strength they had tried so hard to deny. And the audience watching, both inside and across the country, felt something more than shock. They felt possibility. The mic drop had landed. The arrogance had cracked. The brilliance had shone. But outside that chamber, the ripple effect was about to explode. Within minutes of Breyer's words, the chamber's silence gave way to a storm outside its walls. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's counterattack hit social media before the session even ended. A single line, her dismantling of the skeptic's argument, spread across timelines like wildfire. Hashtags ignited. Crockett truth. Brilliance. Inaction. #respect earned. The video replayed on every platform. Twitter feeds lit up with disbelief. Instagram reels looped her calm delivery. TikTok edits paired her words with triumphant music. In living rooms, on buses, in classrooms, people leaned forward on their phones, watching the moment when arrogance crumbled and brilliance took its place. Commentators who had doubted her scrambled to adjust their narratives. The same analysts who once called her too fiery were suddenly praising her composure. Late-night hosts clipped the exchange, calling it the courtroom moment of the decade. Even critics who had mocked her tone were forced to admit she had dominated the chamber with unshakable poise. But the ripple went further than commentary. Communities that had long felt sidelined began celebrating. For immigrants, workers, young women of color, and anyone who had been told they were too much or not enough, Crockett's stand felt personal. She wasn't just defending her argument. She was defending theirs. The cheers weren't only for her victory, but for what it symbolized, that the walls built to exclude could be breached. On the ground, rallies echoed her words. Signs appeared quoting her sharpest lines. Activists and everyday people alike repeated the phrase Breyer had spoken, "Her brilliance cannot be ignored today." It became more than a remark. It became a slogan. Even her harshest opponents could not escape the wave. Clips of their faltering expressions went viral too, replayed with captions mocking the arrogance that melted before her. Composure. Memes circulated, each one hammering home the same truth. The old guard had been exposed. The atmosphere was electric. For once, the conversation wasn't about scandal or spectacle. It was about brilliance, preparation, and dignity commanding the stage. The nation had watched a new voice emerge, not as a guest in the room, but as a force to be reckoned with. And yet, beneath the noise, one lesson stood taller than the rest. When the noise faded, when the hashtags slowed, and when the chamber returned to its ordinary rhythm, the truth of that moment still burned bright. Jasmine Crockett had not won by shouting louder or by bending to the arrogance that surrounded her. She had won by standing firm in her brilliance, by refusing to shrink, by carrying dignity like a shield no one could pierce. Justice Stephen Breyer's words crystallized what millions had already seen. Respect is not born of age, title, or pedigree. It is born of truth. In that chamber, authority did not rest in seniority. It rested in clarity, in courage, in the unwavering voice of someone who had walked through fire and still stood unbroken. Her story reminded the nation that arrogance can dominate for a season, but it cannot stand against preparation. Privilege can close doors, but it cannot extinguish perseverance. The chamber was meant to test her, to expose cracks in her resolve. Instead, it revealed cracks in the system that had underestimated her from the start. The lesson was bigger than law. It reached into classrooms where young girls now saw possibility, into workplaces where immigrants carried their quiet brilliance, into neighborhoods where respect had always felt one step out of reach. Crockett's moment was not just her own. It was a mirror of resilience for all who had been told no. And so the moral stood clear. Dignity cannot be mocked into silence, and truth cannot be drowned out by arrogance. When preparation meets courage, even the highest walls of exclusion begin to crumble. Because in the end, respect is not granted by title. It is earned by truth. The title of this story spoke of respect, and that is exactly what the nation witnessed. Justice Stephen Breyer, a man whose words have shaped history, stopped to recognize Jasmine Crockett's brilliance. And in that instant, the courtroom froze, not because tradition demanded silence, but because truth had commanded it. Moments like this remind us why we watch, why we listen, why we share. They remind us that dignity can cut through arrogance, that preparation can silence doubt, that brilliance has no barriers when it is fueled by purpose. What you saw in that chamber was not just a legal exchange. It was a message to every person who has ever been overlooked. Your voice matters, and when it rises with clarity, the world cannot ignore it. If this moment froze you too, share it. Pass it forward. Let others see that brilliance is not confined to privilege, and that respect is born from truth. Every view, every share, every voice adds weight to the movement that says, arrogance will not have the final word. And if you believe in stories where dignity wins, where courage stands tall, and where truth lights the way, join us. Subscribe, be part of this community, and carry these stories into your own conversations. Because together, we can keep dignity louder than arrogance.